Middleton, Manchester. A place where the gray of the sky often bleeds into the gray of the pavement, and the rain isn't so much a weather event as it is a permanent resident. On Bonnie Brow Street, the terraced houses stand in tight, uniform rows, their red bricks darkened by decades of damp and soot. It is a quiet street, the kind where neighbors recognize each other's cars but rarely know what happens behind the curtains once the sun dips below the Pennines. At number 26, life appeared to follow the same unremarkable rhythm as the rest of the neighborhood. The man who lived there, Thomas Hunt, was 48 years old. To a casual observer, he was just another face in the crowd, perhaps a bit more reclusive than most, a man who preferred the sanctuary of his living room to the local pub. But inside that house, the air didn't smell of domesticity. It smelled of cold calculation and the silent hum of an empire built on shadows. Thomas Hunt didn't need a flashy office or a fleet of branded trucks. He operated with a surgical precision that made the traditional image of a gangster look prehistoric. While other organized crime groups were making noise on the street corners, Hunt was sitting in his armchair, his thumbs moving across a screen. He was the architect of a multi-million-pound machinery, a man who understood that in the modern world, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's an encrypted message. The operation was industrial in scale. We aren't talking about small bags sold in dark alleys. This was wholesale. Cocaine, heroin, MDMA, and amphetamines moved across the country in quantities that would stagger the imagination. Kilograms, not grams. Over 1.8 million pounds worth of Class A and B drugs flowed through a network that Hunt had meticulously mapped out from his Middleton base. He was the ghost in the machine, never touching the product, never seeing the money, always keeping a layer of insulation between himself and the reality of the trade. But an architect needs a foreman, and for Thomas Hunt, that man was Dylan Robinson. Robinson, 32, lived on Fallows Avenue, just a short drive from Hunt's headquarters. If Hunt was the brain, Robinson was the nervous system. He was the man who made the logistics work, the one who turned abstract orders into physical movement. He managed the stash houses, neutral, anonymous self-storage units, where the product was kept in the dark, waiting for the call. These weren't just cupboards for drugs, they were armories and counting houses. In the quiet hours of the morning, while Middleton slept, Robinson would coordinate the couriers. The plan was always the same: keep it moving, keep it quiet, and never stay in one place long enough to leave a scent. They used the UK's motorway network like a private conveyor belt. Vans and cars, looking like any other trade vehicle on the M60 or the M62, carried the cargo to Bristol, to Carlisle, to Newcastle. The genius of the operation lay in its anonymity. The group used encrypted mobile applications, platforms designed to be impenetrable to law enforcement. They spoke in codes that sounded like grocery lists or construction orders. To anyone listening in, it was white noise. To the members of the OCG, the pressure of maintaining such a massive operation began to manifest in small, almost invisible ways. Robinson started visiting Hunt's house more frequently. The messages became more urgent. There was a shipment destined for Bristol, a significant amount of high-purity cocaine that required precise timing. The couriers were ready, the storage units were prepped, and the route was cleared. Hunt sat in his house on Bonnie Brow, watching the rain strike the window pane. He had built this life on the premise that he was smarter than the system. He had separated himself from the grime of the streets, believing that if he never saw the victim, he was never the criminal. But the insulation was thinning. In the storage units, tucked away behind heavy steel doors, the air was still. Kilograms of white powder sat in vacuum-sealed bags, resting alongside boxes of ammunition, 224 rounds, to be exact. The bullets were a silent insurance policy, a reminder that even in a digital empire, the threat of physical violence is the ultimate currency. The Bristol shipment was supposed to be routine. Graham Sykes, a 62-year-old man who looked more like a grandfather than a drug runner, was the chosen courier. He was trusted because he was unremarkable. He drove a car that wouldn't get a second glance from a traffic officer. He kept his speed exactly at the limit. He didn't use his phone while driving. He was the perfect ghost. As Sykes merged onto the motorway, heading south, he felt the familiar weight of the cargo in the hidden compartment. He had done this 18 times before. He knew the stops, the petrol stations, the places where the cameras didn't reach. But as he crossed the border into Derbyshire, he noticed something in his rearview mirror. It wasn't a police car. Not a marked one, anyway. It was just a dark SUV, keeping a consistent distance. The SUV didn't pass him. It pulled in right behind him. Sykes watched through the side mirror as the doors of the SUV opened. He didn't see uniforms. He saw men in plain clothes, moving with a purpose that left no room for error. He looked at the phone in his hand, the one that was supposed to be his lifeline to the architect in Middleton. He had a choice to make. But before he could even process the thought, there was a sharp rap on his window. The rain continued to fall over Greater Manchester, washing away the tracks of the vans and the cars that had moved millions of pounds of misery across the tarmac. But some stains don't wash away. In Middleton, Thomas Hunt finally set his tea down on the table. He walked to the front door and looked out through the spy hole. The street was empty. The orange glow of the street lamps reflected off the wet pavement. Everything looked exactly as it should. And yet, for the first time in a decade, Hunt felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to pack a bag. In Thomas Hunt's world, loyalty was not a moral virtue. It was an operational cost. As the scale of the organized crime group OCG expanded beyond the boundaries of Manchester, Thomas understood that he could no longer rely solely on encrypted messages and burner phones. He needed people who would remain silent, not out of fear, but because they had too much to lose. That was the moment when business became family. Anthony Hunt, Thomas's older brother, was a man of old habits. Unlike his younger brother's digital sophistication, Anthony preferred physical presence. He oversaw the engine room's safe houses where drugs were pressed, cut, and packaged. At an address on Moss Bank Road in Crumpsall, Anthony spent hours in a haze of cocaine dust and the sharp chemical stench of industrial pressing equipment. It was meticulous, toxic, hands-on work, but it ensured that products bearing the Hunt brand consistently met the purity standards demanded by downstream dealers. Alongside Anthony was Rachel Blackburn Stanley. In police records, she appeared to be nothing more than a woman living on Rudston Street in Moston. Within the network, however, Rachel was the driver, literally and strategically. She transported Anthony between locations and acted as his lookout while he handled the drugs. A woman in the passenger seat often reduced suspicion during traffic stops. They looked like an ordinary couple commuting or running errands camouflaged through normality. Meanwhile, Dylan Robinson coordinated the self-storage drug caches with the efficiency of a professional warehouse manager. The group's confidence was at its peak. They trusted encrypted applications. They believed that without hand-to-hand street deals, there could be no evidence. What they overlooked was something decidedly old-fashioned: biological traces. At the Moss Bank processing site, During a moment of carelessness, or perhaps due to the suffocating heat beneath a face mask, a glove was left behind. It carried not only cocaine residue, but Anthony Hunt's DNA. An invisible noose began to tighten. Elsewhere in the network, Lisa Prescott entered the operation not for power, but through emotional obligation. Her partner, James Close, was serving a 36-year prison sentence, the price of a previous criminal empire that had already collapsed. Prison walls did not stop James from directing operations remotely, and Lisa became his proxy, working with the Hunt brothers to keep money flowing into hidden funds. She was seen with Anthony Hunt, and her DNA was also recovered from drug-related items. For Lisa, crime was not a career choice. It was a legacy she could not escape. This network extended beyond blood relatives. It relied on satellites like Robert Earnshaw in Rochdale. Earnshaw was not merely a local dealer. He was dating Thomas Hunt's daughter. That Greater Manchester Police did not rush. They deployed covert surveillance, documenting every visit Robinson made to Hunt's home, every trip Rachel drove Anthony to a storage site. They did not arrest individuals one by one. They waited for the moment when all links aligned, when drugs and money were most clearly in transit. At a house on Henry Street in Leigh, Lisa Prescott began to feel uneasy. Unfamiliar cars lingered too long at street corners. Encrypted calls sometimes carried strange interference. But in this world, paranoia was part of breathing, and they had learned to ignore it in order to continue profiting from greed, the sole motive later cited by Detective Sergeant Shields. Thomas Lockwood, hired to test product quality, had just completed an inspection of a new heroin batch. He was the gatekeeper, ensuring the Hunt brand was not excessively diluted before reaching users. Everything still appeared to be running smoothly. Cash poured in tens of thousands of pounds, bundled with elastic bands, hidden in wall cavities and beneath car floors. But Graham Sykes's journey through Derbyshire changed everything. When he saw plainclothes officers step out of an SUV, he knew his unremarkable existence had failed him. Thomas Hunt's silence in Middleton was no coincidence. It was the beginning of a chain collapse. As news of Sykes's arrest spread through encrypted channels, panic seeped into Bonnie Brow. Dylan Robinson attempted to dispose of storage unit keys, unaware that tactical teams had already secured the facilities. Anthony Hunt and Rachel tried to erase evidence at Rudston Street, but chemical odors and empty plastic bags betrayed their true activities. Inside his home, Thomas Hunt stared at the open suitcase on his bed. He had always prepared for this day. An escape plan had been in place for years: foreign contacts, offshore funds beyond the reach of British banks. He looked out onto the rain-soaked streets of Middleton through a narrow gap in the curtains. The rain fell hard and cold. The knock Hunt had been expecting finally came, but not at his door. It came simultaneously in Moston, Gorton, Rochdale, and Gosport, a coordinated strike at the heart of the organization. When officers breached the Mossbank base, they found Anthony Hunt still wearing gloves. They seized 6 kilograms of amphetamine at Stanley Ainsley's address. They recovered a firearm and ammunition from Aidan Hopkins's home. The picture of a 1.8 pounds million criminal empire was complete. Yet amid the storm of arrests, the sirens, and the flashing blue lights across the city, an unsettling silence hung over number 26, Bonnie Brow. When tactical teams forced entry, the living room was still warm, the television still playing an afternoon news program, but the man in the armchair was gone. Thomas Hunt had made his final move as an architect. He vanished into the very gaps he had created, leaving behind his brother, associates, and family to face the closing bars of prison cells. The OCG members' journey to Crown Court had begun, but the hunt for the mastermind was only just intensifying. The rest of the story is not found in closed case files, but in the footprints left along the escape route of a man with nothing left to lose but his freedom. The silence in the aftermath of a raid is never truly silent. It's filled with the hum of forensic scanners and the rhythmic heavy breathing of officers who have just breached a fortified door. As the sun rose over Manchester, the empire that Thomas Hunt had spent years constructing was being dismantled piece by piece, not with explosives, but with evidence bags and digital imaging tools. At the Moss Bank address, the air remained thick with the chemical tang of cocaine and the metallic scent of hydraulic oil from the pressing equipment. Forensic teams moved through the rooms like ghosts in white suits, tagging items that Anthony Hunt had touched just hours before. The DNA found on the discarded gloves wasn't just a biological marker. It was the thread that would lead the investigation directly to the heart of the family business. In Gorton, at the home of Stanley Ainsley, the discovery was staggering. Hidden away, as if they were nothing more than household supplies, they were waiting for Thomas Hunt. But Thomas was a master of the exit strategy. As the police were cataloging the £61,000 in cash found at Robinson's house and the 15 kilograms of cocaine seized across the various sites, the architect was already a shadow. The investigation revealed that Hunt had lived a life of deliberate isolation. He didn't have a large social media presence. He didn't frequent the clubs where younger gangsters flaunted their wealth. He was a ghost who had finally decided to vanish. The investigators began to focus on the women of the group, Lisa Prescott and Rachel Blackburn Stanley. They weren't just bystanders. They were facilitators. Rachel had driven the car, provided the cover, and kept the household running while Anthony processed the shipments. Lisa had acted as the bridge to James Close, the man whose shadow still loomed over the Manchester drug scene even from behind bars. Their involvement highlighted a grim reality of organized crime. It consumes everything and everyone in its orbit, turning partners into accomplices and homes into hubs for distribution. As the days turned into weeks, the sheer scale of the operation became clear. This wasn't a street-level gang. They were wholesalers. They were the ones who filled the vacuum-sealed bags that eventually ended up in the hands of thousands of users across the UK. The £1.8 million valuation was a conservative estimate. The true cost, measured in the destruction of lives and the surge of violence in the communities they supplied, was uncalculable. In Gosport, Aidan Hopkins was also facing the music. The southern connection had been severed. The 9 trips he had made to the north were now documented in a police file that grew thicker by the hour. The gun found at his home and the drugs in his car were the final nails in the coffin of the Manchester to Hampshire pipeline. The tension in the investigation now centered on a single question: where was Thomas? Search warrants were. The third part of this saga didn't end with a grand finale. It ended with the quiet scratching of pens in a lawyer's office and the heavy thud of cell doors closing for the night. The OCG had been decapitated, but the head was still missing. In the dark corners of the city, people began to talk. Some said he was in Spain. Others said he never left Manchester. As the trial dates were set for late 2025, the survivors of the Hunt OCG realized that their loyalty had bought them nothing but time. Time they would now have to serve in silence. And in the rain-slicked streets of Middleton, the house on Bonnie Brow stood empty, a silent monument to an empire that had vanished as quickly as a breath in the cold Manchester air. The 12th of December, 2025, brought a biting frost to Manchester. the kind that settles deep in the bones and turns the breath of protesters and police officers alike into rhythmic plumes of white mist. Inside the Manchester Crown Court, the air was different still, recycled, and heavy with the scent of floor wax and old wood. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic tension, just the dry, rhythmic sound of a clerk turning pages and the low murmur of legal counsel. The gallery was a tapestry of contrasting lives. On one side, family members sat in hushed clusters, their faces etched with the fatigue of a year spent in waiting rooms. On the other, investigators from the GMP's Serious and Organized Crime Group sat with the stoicism of people who had seen this play out 100 times before. One by one, the sentences were delivered. Dylan Robinson stood first, 12 years and 6 months. The foreman of the operation, the man who held the keys to the architect's chair, was still empty. Thomas Hunt, the man who had sat on Bonnie Brow Street and moved these people like pieces on a board, remained a ghost. The police released his photograph again, a man with a receding hairline and an unremarkable face, the kind of person you would pass in a supermarket without a second thought. He was 48, a fugitive, and now the sole bearer of the Empire's secrets. The investigation had revealed that Hunt was never just a local player. He was a man who understood the value of distance. While Dylan Robinson was being caught with £60,000 in cash and the keys to the storage units, Thomas was already untethered. He had left behind his brother, his daughter's boyfriend, and his most trusted associates to face the crushing weight of the law, while he vanished into the gray horizon. Reports placed him everywhere and nowhere. Some said he had crossed the channel before the first door was kicked in. Others whispered that he was still in the Northwest, hidden in plain sight, protected by a new layer of silence bought with the money that the police hadn't found. The tragedy of the Hunt OCG wasn't just in the drugs or the guns. It was in the collateral damage. Robert Earnshaw, the young man whose only real crime was loving the wrong woman and wanting a shortcut to wealth, was heading to a cell for 3 years and 4 months. Aidan Hopkins, the Southern Link, was facing nearly 4 years. The family business had effectively liquidated its own members. In the weeks following the sentencing, the streets of Middleton returned to their usual rain-soaked quiet. The house on Bonnie Brow was boarded up, its windows staring blankly at the road like the eyes of a blind man. The storage units were emptied, the cocaine destroyed, and the 224 bullets melted down. But the vacuum left by a multi-million-pound operation is never empty for long. Somewhere in another terraced house, another man is likely sitting in an armchair, watching the rain, and looking at an encrypted screen. They will have learned from Thomas Hunt's mistakes. They will be more careful with their DNA, more cautious with their couriers, and even more ruthless with their exits. The police continue to monitor the ports. They check the bank accounts of distant relatives. They wait for a single phone call, a slip-up in a foreign jurisdiction, or a tip from someone who feels the architect has stayed free for too long. They call it Operation Gravity, the belief that eventually everyone comes down. Until then, Thomas Hunt remains a name on a screen, a most wanted poster fading in the window of a local station. He is the man who won the game but lost his world, a king without a kingdom, living in the permanent shadow of a past that is slowly, inevitably catching up.